Hi, everyone. It's Alexander Fernandez with another edition of Video Games Real Talk. I am here today with a very special guest, someone I've wanted to have on the show since forever, Mike Green. Mike Green, how you doing, man? How are you?
I'm doing well, Alex. It's a real pleasure to sit down with you.
Good, man. Thank you for coming on here. And I think, let me go ahead and get the audience ready for this. We're going to have an intellectually stimulating conversation where you will want to break out your dictionary because there will be words utilized that you may have to look up multiple times. But that is exactly why we have super intelligent people like Mr. Green on Video Games Real Talk. So, Mike, please introduce yourself, let people know what you do and what they're about to get into.
Sure. Again, my name is Mike Green. I'm the chief strategist and senior portfolio manager for a firm called Simplify Asset Management. We are an ETF provider that launched in September of last year. An ETF is an investment vehicle. Most people are familiar with them in one form or another, but it's like a mutual fund that can be traded as a single ticker intraday on the stock market. Our products are designed to take advantage of the traditional exposures people would like to see in a market like an S&P 500 index fund, but we actually take advantage of some regulatory changes that were introduced in 2020 and 2019 to craft those by introducing things like derivative overlays, which is actually what my specialty and background has largely been. The use of things like calls, puts, structured products to modify a payout, either making it safer, making it riskier in some situations, offering a convex profile that creates both greater upside and reduced downside. That's the objective of what we're trying to do. Our products are largely targeted at registered investment advisors. The goal is to provide tools that they can use to facilitate their clients' investments. You and I know each other because of my more traditional background, which has been in the hedge fund space. I know you had Raoul Paul on recently. I've developed a bit of a public profile, particularly through the growth of his platform on Real Vision. My background prior to Simplify has been in the hedge fund space, and I'm another, similar to what Raoul described himself as a global macro investor. My background has been based on investing across markets, again, particular focus in derivatives across equities, interest rates, currencies, et cetera, and playing effectively that giant video game that Raoul, I think, described quite eloquently, right? Where you're constantly trying to figure out what the next boss level challenge that you're facing is. My particular approach is actually similar to people who hack games. It's basically figuring out what the rules and strategies are and ways to exploit them by identifying what other players are going to be forced to do. And so part of the reason I think that you and I have such a fun conversation every time we sit down and talk is because it takes on that strategic game development model, right? What are the aspects of gameplay? What are the components of gameplay that we can actually make predictions about what's going to happen and what's going to develop? Part of that I would actually argue comes out of a long background in programming. So before I became an investor, I actually grew up in Silicon Valley. My mom worked on the first patents for Atari and then Genentech and others. I was given a computer when I was 10 years old and told that I couldn't have video games unless I programmed them myself. And so I learned how to write video games, developed, an expertise to the extent, a 10 to 15-year-old can have that in things like programming in assembly language because we used to have limited amounts of memory, et cetera. Sprite graphics, stuff like that. And then transitioned to more of a focus in business and built a software company in the 1990s that was focused around the tools of valuation. Sold that in 1999 and then transitioned into the asset management space. And that kind of in a long-winded way, brings us up to the current.
Well, I mean, this is fascinating. I had no idea that you had actually built a software company, but it now makes completely sense. You're a systems designer. No
Yeah.
wonder. But that's exactly why I mean, this is brilliant. And you know what? For everyone out there, yet again, another example of how video games informs people's lives and they make them quite successful in the end. So, I mean, Mike, you've done an incredible job. And, one of the things that I absolutely just love listening to you about is how you blend history, logic, prediction, macro investment into basically a thesis that really defines an outlook towards the world. And I think that anyone who follows you and listens to your stuff can appreciate just how much analysis you do and you put into things, which is one of the reasons why I wanted you to have on the show. As you said, we've had Raul here, we've had tons of video games people on the show talking about this future that's coming that blends metaverse, blockchain, cryptocurrency, NFTs in this alphabet soup of new economy, new GDP. But this sounds very spectacular. And if I look at your Twitter feed, I can see that you may not buy into all of it. And that's exactly what I want to talk about today. What is your take on what is happening, and why do you feel about it? And why do you feel that way? So tell me, what is the, not the contrarian, but yeah, the other side of the argument? Why is this a horrible idea that's going to fail?
Well, so I actually want to emphasize that I don't think when we talk about why is it a horrible idea and why is this going to fail, I just want to emphasize that I actually don't think I think very few things are horrible ideas. And I actually would broadly argue that I'm probably much more optimistic than most people about the long term success and the innovations that are occurring in things like the metaverse, the gaming world, et cetera, right? In the simplest form, similar to the way that chip stacks have gone from single dimension, two dimensional to now three dimensional, and the linkages across those packaging technologies created the ability to expand capabilities. I would argue that the metaverse is basically taking something that has historically been in relatively finite quantities, land, and is taking each pixel on that map and expanding the value associated with it. Right. So similar to early days of the internet, where people did things like the World Wide Web, where they did pixel advertising, where there's $1 million page where every pixel sold for X amount, sort of thing, right? And behind that was effectively another layer. You guys are building the technology to create an engaging environment that encourages people to think across, the fourth dimension is time, but let's argue a fifth dimension in virtual space, taking any physical location and expanding the actual quote unquote land associated with it, right? The theory of the value of land actually goes back to economics, under what's called the Georgist philosophy, that it's effectively the old adage, buy land, they're not making any more of it. That's always been a stupid way of thinking about it, right? And I use stupid with the ultimate pejorative dynamic. We build land all the time, right? That's what a skyscraper is. A skyscraper is additional land being built on top of valuable land. Once the value of that land crosses over a certain amount, you want to actually expand it in that location. The value of that location becomes the primary dynamic. And so I very much see that within the metaverse. And I very much see that within things like NFTs, et cetera, that you are creating components of actual ownership and scarcity that encourage people to develop along these frameworks. The concerns that you've heard me express, though, are more along the dynamics of the system design and the rules of the system that are being placed in, right? So if you are a system designer, the single most important thing to consider is, one, what is the constraint of the system? What are the limitations that exist within a system, right? So in the early days when I was programming on, very pre-VGA type screens, you would often substitute text-based graphics where you were effectively just modifying the actual ASCII characters to create a visual of a rocket ship or something like that, as compared to the actual graphics, which were very difficult. We didn't have graphic processing units at the time. Recognizing those constraints, recognizing that you were limited to 40 character wide screens by 24 characters deep in many of the early computers, the VIC-20s, the Trash 80s, et cetera. You need to understand those constraints. You need to build a game that is compelling within that. You also need to consider the evolution of the gameplay. And so as a designer, you can't just say, hey, here's the exciting splash screen to start it off. We've all downloaded stuff off of the App Store in one form or another that, you see the compelling video and then you go to play it and you're like, oh my God, this is the most boring game on the planet, right? That dynamic of thinking through the development of the system is where I have most of my concerns around a lot of the behavior that exists in things like Bitcoin in particular. And so anyone who is bored out of their mind and goes from this podcast to search for other commentary that I've made around stuff, will find that I am bearish on Bitcoin in particular. The reason that I'm actually bearish on Bitcoin is because it's based on a fundamental misunderstanding of economic theory. Right? So it's predicated on the idea of Austrian economics, that the greatest marketability, that scarcity creates value, et cetera. these are all things that, like most um, narratives, there is an element of truth to them, right? As a prehistoric or pre-science people, we believed that the sun transited across the sky, drawn behind a chariot, a golden chariot, with a sun god behind it, right? Did we have any evidence for that? No, we didn't. We actually posited, hey, this is a potential system that worked. We introduced supernatural dynamics to it. A lot of the way that people think about economics is that there is, actual truth, right? That we know these things. The reality is that we're fumbling our way through these systems. We actually can't treat economics as a true science because we very rarely get to have replicable and repeatable experiments, right? And actually, one of my primary collaborations is with a theoretician. His name is Ole Peters. He's a mathematician and physicist out of London. And Ole's work is actually built around the idea that economics has a very fundamental misunderstanding at its base level, right? The idea of expected utility, or the idea that a system can be modeled in what's referred to as a Monte Carlo simulation, right? Where you run repeated simulations to get a sense for how something works. That's actually built on a very flawed understanding of the world that we inhabit. And so this is one of these things that I think gamers in particular can fall into this trap, because it's very easy to hit the reset button and try it again, right? And so you get to do the boss level over and over and over again. And so you try strategies that you might not otherwise try because you get to live again. A system that's referred to as ergodic versus non-ergodic. I just want to emphasize what this actually means. These words that you're going to have to look up, as you said at the start, right? So an ergodic system is one in which the time series average is the same as the ensemble average. The easiest way to think about that is rolling dice. If one person rolls a dice 1,000 times, or 1,000 people roll a dice one time, you're going to get almost identical distributions of outcomes. But if one person invests over 1,000 years versus 1,000 people investing over 1 year, you're going to get radically different distributions of outcomes, right? So the first system, an ergodic system, the time series average equals the ensemble average. A non-ergodic system is one where the time series average potentially bears no resemblance whatsoever to the ensemble average. And most of the theories of economics that we have are predicated on this idea that an ergodic system is what we're ultimately working with, that we can run simulations, that we can say, hey, it only matters what happens in the aggregate. And that's just not true. You would play video games very differently if you had to put quarters in them as compared to if you get to hit the reset button. Right? And again, I grew up in an era of arcades. I think you probably skirted that on its edge. Your behavior was very different when you're paying 25 cents, which was basically, all the money your mom gave you at
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
time.
I mean, it mattered. That moment of time. I mean, that's real money into the system.
Correct.
Absolutely.
Right. So that would be a great example of where you see my objections to this, because by and large, people are treating these dynamics and these systems that we're trying to adopt as if they don't have real world consequences, as if we can hit the reset button. And I fundamentally think that's a wrong view.
Okay, so okay, this is good because is the issue the fact that it was the way it was designed, that it gives all these freedoms, this idea of freedom. I mean, libertarians love Bitcoin. I mean, it's this idea of freedom. It's no one can control it. It's ran by the machines. The consequences are real because people are exchanging real value for perceived value. I mean, but then we can argue if that's not how money works anyway. But let's just take a step back. But in that argument of the fact that it was designed based on a flawed way of thinking, it sounds like basically people don't want to accept the fact, in what I understand from you, that the flaws that are inherent to the system will create disastrous outcomes just based on the fact that, well, people, they're not playing it like it has consequence because they seem to think that it's just going to keep going up. They don't seem to think that this could actually go down, or even worse, that it can be manipulated. And so the question I have is, like, at least when I read your arguments, at least when the nice marks on Twitter, are that people have this pure blind faith of, no, it's pure, it's real, you know, it's literally the deity that created it wants it this way, versus it's made by man, it's probably going to break. Is that the issue, or is it even more fundamentally different from that for you?
Um, you're close enough that I think we can actually work from that. And I think you used a very important phrase. It's made by man, therefore it can break, right? Um, I'm not implying that there's a supernatural force behind the US dollar or anything else. I want to emphasize that systems of forgiveness emerged over the last 500 years that did not exist in the past. There's Within libertarianism, there's actually a remarkably retributionist streak, right? It's, well, the consequences of your outcomes, or of your situation in life is a function of the choices that you made, right? That tends to be the underlying philosophy behind libertarianism. Now, anyone who has played a video game knows that there are actually situations in which adverse outcomes can occur that have nothing to do with you. We call those glitches in game design, right? You could play the game, you could play it beautifully, and the designer screwed something up
Yeah,
that means you can't progress past a certain level,
very true.
right? That
Hardware
makes it
failure.
into the reviews of the game, and people
Hmm.
ultimately say, well, I'm not going to play this game because there's an error that prevents me from doing this. Now, you can patch that, right? If you're a thoughtful game designer, you can get out there and patch it. Or you could adopt an attitude that says, well, screw you telling me my system's not perfect. My system is perfect. You just don't know what you're doing. The Bitcoin mantra is pretty much that second one. Have fun staying poor. Not gonna make it, right? And it's designed to actually trigger that lizard brain, the amygdala component of our brain. Because at the end of the day, we're social creatures. We live in a world where exclusion from the tribe historically meant that you would die, right? I mean, like, when we think about the dynamics of what excommunication from the Catholic Church means, right? Like, we can laugh about that today. Oh my gosh, I got excommunicated from the Catholic Church. Who the hell cares? Right? Well, what that meant was that you were not going to make it, right? Nobody was allowed to interact with you. Nobody could rent a home to you. Nobody could sell you a house. Your business was incapable of functioning. You were effectively a persona non grata, right? That meant something very different in an environment in which that threat actually meant something. It meant that if you were not part of the social tribe, you were likely to die. Even more extreme if we go back to a cave model, right? You didn't necessarily have to kill somebody, you just expelled them from the tribe. We see this with chimpanzees or lions or any number of other mammals that have social aspects to them. Excommunication equals death. And so when you say to somebody, have fun staying poor, or you're not going to make it unless you buy into this system, that's designed to appeal to that very basic survival instinct and is extraordinarily manipulative. And you should be very cautious when people are marketing to you under that angle, because that's what they're doing.
It's fascinating because you really just you laid out the entire thing about systems. When people say code is law, what they're saying is that there's no humanity behind this. It's literally 0 and 1. It's binary. So really, when you just when I was hearing you talk, what came to me was just straightforward. It's that there is no forgiveness because there is no humanity. There is no one looking at it. It's a system saying off, on, yes, no. And if you happen to be on the wrong side of that, you're done. And there's
Correct.
no going back. So the unforgiveness, or what effectively is the serious ramifications of loss that can happen. And, we can argue that it happens in a financial system, except our system still is interpreted by people, and people have emotions. They're rational and irrational, but they can see past the rule to interpret what the outcome should have been or could potentially be. Yet in a system like Bitcoin, no,
It's binary.
it's
Correct.
binary.
100%.
So okay, so this is the thing. So I think this is fascinating because, like, I would have never. I mean, honestly, when I think about it, it's like that's a very it's a logical response to the lack of emotions and sentiment, but it makes complete sense because in the end of the day, like you're saying, Your community, which is what matters in the end, which is the reason why all of this exists, communal living. Would you say then basically the issue with Bitcoin is that it creates almost a selfishness? It almost propagates selfishness, winner takes all type of attitude at that point in time. If in the end of the day the system is 0 and 1, I win, you
I
lose.
think that is you are now coming back to the core error that sits at the center of it. Because if you play through the Bitcoin game, the incentive to hodl, to effectively not contribute to the system, to not take risks in the system, ultimately lead to the gameplay devolving to a single individual owning all Bitcoin in existence and having tremendous incentives to behave in ways that are deleterious to the other market participants. That's the exact opposite of what an economy actually is, right? And this is where that very fundamental misunderstanding sits. An economy is not a function of me taking from you or you taking from me. An economy is me doing favors for you and you doing favors for me. Right now, we exchange tokens that we call money to encourage and facilitate those exchanges, right? So that we don't have elements of time preference, et cetera. But the flexibility of a monetary system that allows a Federal Reserve or a government to print additional currency is actually founded on this basis of forgiveness, right? It allows people to take risk, accumulate resources from other people, try to deploy them in a novel way. And if it fails, it doesn't create permanent damage. It actually creates temporary damage. That's what that's why things like personal bankruptcy, limited liability corporations, et cetera, were such extraordinary innovations. They facilitated risk taking in our society in a way that hadn't existed previously. Now, what people correctly look at the system today, and they'll identify things like the Cantillon effect, et cetera, those who are in a position to influence the system have remarkable advantages, right? Whether that is direct access to policymakers, whether that is lobbying, we're discovering in crypto just how cheap it is to buy lawmakers in many situations, right? So, Kristen Siama has just been called out for basically flipping on blockchain technology and crypto dynamics for the princely sum of $30,000, right? Like, it's extraordinary how cheaply people can be bought. That's a system of corruptness that is absolutely worth objecting to. But to focus on destroying the system to correct the abuses of the system and introducing a system that has absolute lack of forgiveness, even the Catholic Church sold indulgences, right? Now, we will all look at indulgences or confession and say, well, those are systems that led to abuses of the system. We probably should have never had it. But imagine a world in which one mistake, right? I mean, so let's flip back on the true religious aspects of it. And I'm not a religious person, just to be very clear. I'm actually an atheist, but I think that the systems of religion, the learnings behind it, are actually quite important, right? So, what did Jesus ultimately teach us, or what were the teachings of Jesus? Which is to forgive those who sin if they repent, right? If you make a mistake, if you acknowledge your mistake, you should actually embrace that. People should look at that and say, that's a wonderful thing. You took a risk, you failed. Welcome back to the tribe. Let's take another shot at this. Right? That's a system that's built on building something as compared to a system built on takings.
It's interesting when you defined economy that way, of basically us doing favors for each other in exchange for tokens. And in the end of the day, we're both winning by participating. And of course, it's being governed by those who realize the will of the people and what is happening to them. It's being monitored. Again, we're emotional, we're sentient, we see what's happening. Therefore, we can make decisions. But in a Bitcoin system or in a blockchain system, code is law. It makes a decision. It doesn't care about your feelings. It doesn't care about the circumstance that led to the default or that led to this action taking place, and it executes. Now, when I look at this, and I'm so happy you're here, man, because honestly, I literally go back to the time when this concept of this technology, it's been around for a while, but when it truly started to take shape, 2009, 2010. Remember what was going on in '09 and '10?
Of course.
The fallout of the crisis, everyday people got screwed. everyone's on the street, no faith in the system, everything broke. And then there's something that comes out that says, hey, you know what? The corruption, the you don't have friends in power, you don't need to. Here's the solution, which clever when I start to think about it from that perspective, that it's like, yeah, give me the elixir to solve the issues that I see with the current system, because there was no forgiveness for me, but there was forgiveness for all the banks who really didn't need to be forgiven. And yet at the same time, I lost everything. Everyday person. When I look at that, and I'm 40, so it was like the prime. I was in what, 27, 28 years old when this happened. I remember watching the entire world implode just like everyone else did. And my generation, the millennials, are like, we're broke, we have no houses, we haven't had any real earning power adjustments to our wages. There's nothing here. So this idea of a system that is based on code, that's on off, becomes intoxicating, because then, okay, it can't be manipulated, quote unquote. But if I follow what you were saying and I think about it, to that race to the bottom of it leading to that one person who becomes pharaoh or the emperor, because that's literally what that sounds like, then I'm like, hey, you know what, maybe the old system's a hell of a lot better, because at least there's an emotional human being, perhaps not a sociopath, and that's the other side of it too. So that's where I get torn between it, because on one side, the technology is fantastic, transparency, we have speed of transactions, trust in a trustless world. But then at the same time, when I take that no governance except code is law, then it gets pretty freaky, and then it turns into Terminator, and I'm not liking Skynet. I'm not liking that, you know what I mean? So that's where it
No,
gets
no,
that.
and the irony, of course, is that's exactly how the system is set up. I encourage people to actually gameplay through a system that has a shrinking quantity of tokens associated with it. And the rates of loss in Bitcoin now exceed the rates of mining in Bitcoin. So we actually have a permanently shrinking money supply. And just to emphasize this, like, I actually became interested in Bitcoin almost immediately upon its release, began talking to people about it in 2010, 2011, 2012. I've owned Bitcoin. There is a story that I told in an initial debate around Bitcoin around my wife suggesting buying $10,000. And I said, buy $100,000. And that scared her out of it. I share that not because I'm trying to say that I'm salty or angry about this. You know me well enough to know that I'm not salty or angry about anything, right? I'm actually just very concerned about the path that the system is falling forward, is following forward, not falling forward. Um, and the rationale that actually does make some sense is the reason we went off the gold standard is because gold, first of all, we never truly had a gold standard. We always had a credit based standard, but gold was the underpinning. It effectively created a required exchange rate, right? Money could be exchanged for gold. Gold could be exchanged for money. It created actually a feedback system that limited the power of governments. And that actually is very, very important. I think that's really, really important to understand. But the reason that the gold standard failed was because of an exploding population that was tied to fundamental innovations that existed in humanity. Germ theory of disease suddenly led to people understanding, hey, maybe it's a bad idea to poop in our streets and cause typhus outbreaks in urban environments, right? That had been a fundamental limit to population expansion before. Same thing with the dynamics around plagues, et cetera, right? They all had similar components to them. By and large, we solved that problem with the sanitization. That the other thing that really hit, of course, was infant and female mortality during childbirth process. We addressed infant mortality, and then in the 1930s, through the introduction of antibiotics and to a lesser extent anesthetics, we addressed the issues of intra-life or during life mortality, right? Middle-age mortality, effectively collapsing the rates of random death that would occur if you cut yourself while shaving. That led to an exploding population, which meant that the stock of gold per capita fell sharply, right? After remaining relatively stable for an extended period of time. There is a very important distinction between Bitcoin mining and gold, and I'm going to come back to that in a second. But that deflationary condition is fundamentally what broke the world in the 1930s. Right? That system, with its lack of being able to address it, that system we had to exit that system. When you think about that type of dynamic going forward, the world is slowly adjusting to the much higher rates of, or much lower rates of infant mortality in every region around the world, the much higher cost of raising children, the reduced value associated with having children, et cetera. If you're not relying on your children to provide your social security in the form of income that they earn and you live together as a family, it actually becomes an extraordinary burden. And so you're seeing this manifest itself in falling fertility rates, falling childbirth rates all around the globe. There is an argument that says we need to return back to a system that reflects that type of scarcity, right? Effectively limiting the quantity of money per capita. That's what initially drew me to an understanding Bitcoin. Now, the problem is that Bitcoin has two issues that are different than the gold standard. The first is when Bitcoin is lost, by and large, it becomes truly non-recoverable, right? If I forget my keys, that's gone, can't be recovered, right? Similar to gold transiting an ocean voyage, sinking to the bottom of the ocean floor, made it unavailable. But that was not that big of a deal because human innovation meant that mining could continue to produce the quantity of gold that was necessary against it. And again, an understanding of history becomes important if you look at the Americas, the colonies in particular, the American colonies in particular. They were facing a constant shortage of coinage, right? Constant shortage of money in physical form that facilitated commerce. Um, that hit its peak, its zenith in terms of challenges around 1900, when we were simultaneously seeing a rapid rise in the developed world population tied to reduced infant mortality, and gold technology was not able to respond. This is why William Jennings Bryan, with the cross of gold dynamic, bemoaned the deflationary conditions. Now, the thing that is different about Bitcoin and gold is gold was able to respond to the incentive structure of higher gold prices by utilizing human innovation to produce more gold. The cyanide process was introduced roughly around 1900 that suddenly allowed far greater recoveries of gold from things like the mining tailings, the existing mine operations, et cetera, and increased the quantity of gold that was available, forestalling for a brief period the worst components of the deflationary conditions that existed, right? Bitcoin has no such mechanism, right? It's actually, again, code is law. We will never increase the supply. And that actually creates permanent deflationary conditions, which many of the advocates in the system will say, well, that's wonderful. That means if I hold my money, I have increased purchasing power. But that discourages risk taking. It discourages me encouraging people to do innovative favors for me today. It incentivizes me to refuse to engage in the system and simply hold what I have. That's not building.
Yeah, and in that standpoint, basically, at that point, there's no innovation. People become rent seekers. They effectively become landlords. They're
Bingo.
holding,
You
and
just nailed it. That is
yeah,
exactly the system as it is designed to play out. And who is marketing it to you? The existing landholders.
no, and so okay, and this is
I mean, in
brilliant.
all seriousness, the
No, no,
difference,
you're right.
why is Greenland called Greenland? Because Eric the Red wanted to market it to people, right?
Yeah,
Come to this green, wonderful place, right? Now, admittedly, it was slightly better then than it is today. We can get into the global warming dynamics if we want to, but the broader point is people are always trying to sell you something. I'm
yeah,
trying to sell you something, right? I'm trying to sell a vision of the future that for me is hopeful. I don't necessarily have a monetary interest in it, but I do have three children. And
yeah,
again, you and I know each other personally, you know how
absolutely,
important that is to me.
big
I
time.
look at a world as it plays out under Bitcoin, and I don't want them in that world.
Do you believe then, because like you said, that cyanide comes in to help the gold process? Do you not think there'll be that moment in time where someone says, you know what, I, you know, you're right. We need to have a moment that basically makes us there. And maybe it's the side chains, maybe it's these altcoins. Do you think those could be the answer to that? Or is it just fundamentally broken because in the end, the scarcity idea, the fact that it gets destroyed, the fact that there will never be more just makes it irrelevant? I mean, is there I know you're a hopeful person, so let me ask: is there hope that it can be fixed?
I do not think that Bitcoin is redeemable, right? The incentive structure that exists for those who currently hold the 18.6 million of the 21 million coins that have been mined, more accurately, the 14.4 million from that 18.6 that continue to exist and have not been lost in one form or another. Their incentive structure today is to drive the price higher and maximize their wealth. I think there is very little consideration of the fact that the Bitcoin universe has what's referred to as a Gini coefficient, a level of inequality that is far worse than any system that has ever existed in the world. Right? It's a system that is so deeply unequal that it's disastrous, right? And just like a revolution in the United States, or more accurately, the American colonies, the former British colonies, was required to force those who were in power to recognize the need to change. Ultimately, I think that system has to break, right? And the incentives, exactly as we saw with nobility in the 17th and 18th century, is to say, screw you. The reality of what happened over the last 500 years, and this is the thing that scares me most, right? So this is where I am most pessimistic, is I'm not at all convinced that we have the capability of expressing that forgiveness because we largely lack the threat of going elsewhere. Right? So, I mean, this is a deeply depressing thought for me, which is that the innovations that occurred in governance, democracy, individual freedoms, et cetera, that emerged basically from the period 1492, really more accurately 1450 on, was a function of populations being able to take advantage of the Chinese proverb, the mountains are high and the emperor is far away, to get themselves on a ship, traverse an ocean, travel far enough away from the governing authorities that they had an exit voice to say, you guys are really screwing this up. I'm checking out of the system. I'm going to go build something else. Right. And it was very unfortunate for Native Americans that that occurred, but the Western world broadly benefited from it. And, that is what it is. It stinks in some ways and it's awesome in others. Um, but the reality is that no longer exists. And what you hear, certainly sitting in my seat more than anything else, is people increasingly saying, well, where are you going to go? Again, that's where I get hopeful in your world.
Yeah.
Because what you're actually creating is the surplus, the additional land, the places to go that potentially raise humanity to a next level, right? Separate us in some ways from the physical limits that we have and move us further in that direction. My fear is that we're doing so under a code is law, a programmer's framework, a sense of arrogance about our perfection as system designers that is going to lead to very unfortunate outcomes.
No, and I think you're absolutely right to have those fears. I mean, as someone who basically works in video games and deals with all types of system designers, and let's be clear, whether you're an engineer, an artist, or in between, there is a perfectionism. There's always an arrogance in creation, irrespective if you paint it or you program it or you design it. And it has to be tempered. As you were talking, this idea that where else are you going to go? Well, where we're going is the metaverse.
Mm-hmm.
So let's lay out a vision for the metaverse because clearly we have to go somewhere. And, if we're to believe basically Meta, Facebook, whatever they want to be called, there's a utilitarian version of the metaverse. Then there's basically the free running, it's anything version of the metaverse. But as an economist, as a historian, as someone who's looked at systems, what do you believe can help us construct a fairer, greater metaverse with an economy that would actually continue the greatness of humanity? Because in the end, that's the streak that I get from you, is that there's this desire for the human being to succeed and to improve. What would you guide us on to make sure that we can build this, at least not utopia, but that it doesn't become a dystopian hellhole? What do you think we need to do?
Well, I think that's actually part of the point that I'm making at the very beginning when I highlight the dynamic of actually understanding the economics, right? Because when you if you go back and you read the history of what actually happened when you first brought people over to the United States, for example, the Massachusetts Bay Company attempted to come over as a religious entity that engaged in communitarianism, right? The idea that everybody basically got what they needed, and there was nobody really responsible for their own production. They failed miserably. People starved to death. The productivity of the economy was terrible until you actually established dynamics of ownership and gave people the opportunity to differentiate themselves, et cetera. But that didn't happen immediately, right? And it didn't happen in a code as law framework. There were systems that were designed to allow that feedback. And you see that in video game design, right? I mean, good video game companies and designers pay an incredible amount of attention to the reviews and the hacks and everything else that's going on because they're interested in understanding the edge cases that develop in their world, right? They're very focused on that. They want those feedback systems. The beauty of democracy or a Republican system is that you actually have elected representatives that are supposed to pay attention to what you say. And so I would encourage people to actually return to those principles, to return to the principles of forgiveness, self-actualization, experimentation, robustness, to use the term that Nassim Taleb coins in terms of financial markets. How do we create systems that have feedback loops that are positive in their construction? Right? That's the genius of a John Locke or of a Rousseau or of a Montesquieu, right? They had the luxury of thinking through these systems. Did they think through them perfectly? John Stuart Mill, et cetera. No, of course they didn't. David Hume, right? I mean, these are brilliant, brilliant thinkers operating within the regime of the limitations of human capability, operating from the 18th century and the 16th century. But you can actually bring that forward to today and say, well, we've created momentary surplus that largely insulates, particularly our elites, from their extreme actions. But are those actually the guiding principles under which we want to construct worlds? I don't think that's true.
No, I totally feel you on that. And that's so this is the thing when I hear you, what do you think about DAOs? How do you feel about that? Where basically there's governance tokens where everyone basically owns in what they're building, almost like a commune in a way. I mean, is that something to take into this? I mean, they're becoming popular. We're seeing that spreading around, but how do you feel about that as a source of, say, one form of economy within this new world, this new universe that we're creating?
So a DAO is basically an unregistered corporation, right? In its simplest form, and
It's a guild.
it's
Yeah.
yes, but even within guilds, I mean, one of the things that's really important to remember is that the decision to participate, the locality, the shared common objectives that existed within guilds had pros and cons. And it is in guilds that we actually see the origins of the corporation, right? The limited liability corporation came out of guild like constructions, charters that were granted to entities that had the capability of doing certain things, were basically granted a license by the centralized authority to do something. A DAO is effectively doing that in the same way, but exacerbates the agency component in a lot of ways, right? Because I've raised money for the DAO. There's people who are actively involved in the output and operation of it. And we have not yet gotten through the process of reconciling that was referred to as the agency issue of management, right? Have we encountered situations where DAOs have been engaged in behavior that the population, the broader holdings of DAOs, don't agree with, don't want, don't appreciate, um, where we effectively are able to restructure that management in an effective way? I just think they're untested in that framework. I don't see any problem with them from a legal structure. I think one of the big issues, and DAOs are a perfect example of a response within an organization. We have way too much regulatory and licensing dynamics, right? If I want to become a hair cutter, it's not enough for me to become a hair cutter, right? I can't just get a pair of scissors and a razor and a shaver of one form and offer somebody the opportunity to come to my house to get haircuts, right? Theoretically, I could excel into that framework. Instead, I need to attend certification process, and I need to do 800 hours of training, and these are silly. It's ridiculous. We know this, right? The process of licensing, and if you've ever had a business that has failed, shutting down a business is actually remarkably challenging, right? So DAOs are growing in response to that, and I think that's actually great. But in terms of their ultimate impact, again, going back to the code is law type framework, we have a lot of unanswered questions. And we're just so early in this process that making any prediction about it is really difficult. But broadly speaking, I think DAOs reflect an increasing reality that companies or organizations of individuals increasingly operate across borders. They operate across space and across physical time, right? In a way, their communications are largely electronic and therefore not limited to a particular physical location or time zone that has linkages to the traditional corporate structure. So I'd be very surprised if we didn't see them continue to flourish. But somewhere in between, we have no idea how this works out, and a deterministic system that is run by a regulatory body, that's a wide space.
So when you think about the nation state, because this is always what comes to mind to me, is like, oh, it's great. We're living this, the fifth dimension, which great. We're doing all these things, but our corporeal beings live within borders. And
Yep.
those borders have rules, and those rules are different, as we've seen. There's, especially with the great power battle that's happening around us.
Yes.
How do you see that influencing the metaverse and vice versa? And we can't have this conversation without us talking about China.
Yeah.
So you have the
Yeah.
US version, you have China, and the rest of the world. How do you
Yeah.
see this playing out?
Um, uh, you were asking me to forecast a system that has hugely stochastic elements to it, and it's part of the reason why you hear me raise my objections to systems that I ultimately think are harmful, particularly to those who value independence and individual freedoms. My biggest fear about China is not actually China, because I fundamentally think that China is a failed entity. I think the obvious evidence for that is the collapse in birth rates that they've experienced, the fact that people don't emigrate into China, they try to get out of China, right? And so again, this goes back to components of an economy and how to properly think about it. When you use phrases like GDP, recognize that you're making assumptions around what is economic activity, what is not economic activity. And so I just want to reframe that for a second before we move on, right? Most people, particularly in the crypto space and within the Bitcoin maximalist space, refer to the United States as a failed entity, right? They'll look at the rising debt levels, they'll look at the trade deficit, they'll say the US dollar is toast and it's a complete disaster, et cetera. And what they don't understand is that they're actually looking at an accounting system that fails to properly price and value the most fundamental asset, which is people. Right? The US has the world's greatest business model. People around the world give birth to children, invest their greatest efforts, their greatest affection, a ridiculous amount of their time, energy, and resources in raising and educating those children. And then the most entrepreneurial, independent, thoughtful individuals within those societies try to pick up and come to the United States. Like, that's an extraordinary gift of human capital that the rest of the world delivers to us because of our model of individual freedoms. Right? But it shows up nowhere in trade statistics. It doesn't show up in GDP. Right? And so again, like, the systems of accounting that we use, and this is one of the things I emphasize, we do not have good systems of accounting. Right? The system of GDP emerged in the 1930s under the guidance of Simon Kuznets, who actually advocated for the inclusion of human capital, but because it was perceived as non-taxable, it was discarded. Right? So we have the ability to track this stuff and to measure these things and to think in a more fulsome manner about what we want to accomplish in our society, but we just don't do it currently. Right? And so that's a legitimate critique that I would offer to the existing system. It's one of the areas that I'm most hopeful about systems like blockchain or crypto that facilitate improved transparency and tracking of that type of information. What is the value of a human being obviously stepping aside the dynamics of forced immigration, et cetera. The second thing that I would highlight is that there are two very different models that exist. There's effectively the centralized control dynamic that exists under China, and an authoritarian system can be thought of in a really simple way. It is an attempt to make the public sector more efficient. Instead of trying to consider what everybody wants to do and having 1,000 voices within your guild all shouting out and saying, hey, I want this, I want this, I want this, you listen to one person. And the entire collective body has to get behind that. Now, that system is actually very productive in its early stages because you're taking all the resources and focusing it effectively behind the tip of the sphere. What does Xi want? Right? What does Mussolini want? What does Stalin want? Right? You're taking those resources, you're focusing them. But it's also an incredibly frail system. It's a fragile system. It's not robust. Because if that individual makes a mistake, if that individual doesn't properly understand how things are developing, that system lacks experimentation. That's what entrepreneurship is all about. That's what those systems of forgiveness are all about, is encouraging experimentation in an almost evolutionary framework that says, hey, try a whole bunch of stuff. Some's going to work, some's not. Right? And that's inherently inefficient, and we're constantly drawn to try to make it more efficient by establishing systems of control and focusing it behind that sphere. The biggest risk that we face in the West is overreacting to China's momentary burst of efficiency in the authoritarian sector and changing our strategies so that they reflect theirs, being reactionary instead of embracing the strength that's created within our system.
So when I look at that, and it's again, it's these two modes of systems, these two ways of looking at it. One leader, follow me, 1,000 voices, let's figure this out together. When we talk about the metaverse, you're probably going to see both models play out.
100%, totally agree. And,
And
and and like we all react with
yeah,
a moderate amount of horror seeing Mark Zuckerberg guide us down a particular direction, right?
I know, right? It's like even
No, I
Iceland.
mean, you actually, like, we all feel it. There is the uncanny valley aspect to it. We're like, dude, that is not the guy I want to hang out with. Um, I mean, I know he's got great toys, right? And
Yeah.
like, sure, it'd be fun to hang out at his house and fly on multiple private jets and get to see new technology. But like, you don't really want to be in a cave with that guy.
It's funny in the end of the day just how human we really are. It doesn't matter about what we decorate, anything around us. Who we are is who we are, and that's the one thing computers have never really truly been able to remove. It's you are who you are, and I think that's something where when I think about these versions of the metaverse that are being built and the types of governance, whether it's the DAO, the democracy, the authoritarian, whatever ways these come together, these systems are reflective of the personalities, right? So when we go to company X's metaverse, their version will be literally a reflection of the culture they have as a company, reflective of the leadership they have, and if it is a authoritarian style company, what type of sociopath is guiding forward. And let's be clear, it's not just the authoritarian side; it could very much be the democracy side. Who got to the power? Who is running this group? And to me, I always take a step back and look at it, and I think it's a fascinating experiment in what does it mean to be human, and how we work as individuals and systems. Because in the end, it's the biggest social experiment I think we've ever seen in 100 years is about to play out in front of us, and I just hope that it's not super tragic. So I mean, when you look at this in the nation state perspective, knowing that there's a metaverse that's going to come on top, knowing that China totally disengaged with blockchain, which I'm curious, or at least on Bitcoin, I'm curious, is that because they played through? Do you think they played through the scenario and realized, oh no, we're going to get caught in this just like everyone else? Or was that more of a we got something better? What do you think on that one?
So my on China, I think that there's a couple of interesting angles on it, right? So one, it's not at all clear to me that the game that is perceived being played is actually what's being played. So China did not ban Bitcoin mining. China banned unauthorized Bitcoin mining. In other words, consolidating control within the state sector of a resource that can be sold on the global stage. right? Now, a lot of people will look at that and be like, oh, China tried to ban Bitcoin and couldn't do it. Man, I think that's a really bad interpretation of what just happened. I also think that going back to the video gaming universe or we as a society are very focused on immediate gratification, right? So you see a headline like that, or you see a headline from China saying, "Oh, we're gonna, reduce our carbon emissions, and we're gonna do it, X, Y, Z," right? They are very much taking advantage of Lenin's old adage of capitalists will sell you the rope that can be used to hang them, right? Remarkably talented at the manipulation of the headlines versus what's actually happening behind the scenes. So, forgive me for not fully embracing the narrative that China has abandoned Bitcoin as a resource. I do think more broadly that what we are seeing develop within China is the recognition that things like blockchain technology, centralized digital bank currencies, systems of social credit engineering, et cetera, offer unprecedented avenues for control, for focusing those resources at the tip of the spear, right? And so I think China is very much embracing that aspect of it. And in the Bitcoin proponents' defense, Bitcoin is actually, if it were broadly adopted by the Chinese population, would be a impediment to that degree of control, right? I don't know whether Bitcoin will succeed in breaking that dynamic. In a weird way, I would encourage its development within China while discouraging its development within the U.S. because I'd love to see that system fail, right? But unfortunately, I think the U.S. is so desperate to appear hands off and try to embrace innovation and growth that people are just not very good at playing the game forward, right? Actually thinking about what happens in the multi-stage framework. We don't have a lot of systems designers on this.
No, we don't. So, do you think that the U.S. will embrace it? I mean, I'm obviously don't want to get like as a off. Do you think that ultimately regulation says, you know what, we can't stop the beast, the genie's out of the bottle. All we can do is attempt to regulate, or will we actually have a policy that says, you know what, no further from what rampant speculation? I mean, what is your feeling on that?
Again, my biggest fear is that the U.S. is heading towards a need to drive efficiency into the public sector. Right, the public sector has expanded dramatically. It is remarkably inefficient. We're 40 years into the Reagan revolution of deregulation and loss of control in the public sector. Um, and today, the argument is, well, we need even more deregulation. We need to strip the state of all of its powers. I think it's a terrible tragedy if we do that. If we fail to recognize the mutual value that can be created through the public sector and a well-guided public sector. And I think we're setting up the conditions for a very violent reversal of those dynamics, right? Effectively, we preach tolerance, preach tolerance, preach tolerance, allowing increasingly terrible behavior, and then ultimately have to deal with our teenagers going to rehabilitation, being institutionalized, et cetera, right? That's the sort of system that I think we're setting up. I think we're setting up a violent reaction to it. Barry Weiss, for example, ex New York Times, now running her own podcast empire, has begun to speak very explicitly about this, and you can feel it. You can feel it developing. You can feel the anger bubbling beneath the surface, the resistance to the continued tolerance. Right, that's a very dangerous combination. And quite frankly, I'm terrified of it.
I mean, I think that's a very good point. And then when you take in the fact that basically you have a lack of trust, a lack of people looking at each other, being divided on facts, and then you basically put in the fact that money is scarce from a lot of people. I mean, you get the concoction, and I get that. We've hinted and we've spoken about this before, where it gets kind of crazy. And in other parts of the world, I'll be honest with you, it's not as intense as it is here. And that is the one thing I will say. I lived overseas for nearly 20 years. Come back here, you feel the weight, you feel the intensity of the American system. And that's just something that I don't know how we let that pressure out in a way that doesn't turn into like an exploding crock pot, because it just feels intense. Uh, And maybe the metaverse will do it. I don't know. Maybe us going into this other realm will at least give us something to decompress from. I don't know. I mean, yeah,
It's a super valid point, and I would this it's one of the reasons why I would argue that the social experiment that we're engaged in is actually not the first one in 100 years. It's the first true experiment we're facing in 500 years, where we've now exhausted the physical land component. We don't have the capability to get on a boat or get on a plane and travel elsewhere in the world and improve our living standards in a way that we couldn't before, right? The Horatio Alger dynamic of go, or I think that's not who it is, but I'm blanking on it. Go West, young man, right? Um, really represented actually an opportunity for people to improve their standard of living. Immigrants coming to the United States from most regions around the world instantaneously, simply by virtue of geographical relocation, change their earning stream and their cash flow stream and their individual freedom stream, at least historically. If you were to go back to the 19th century, if you came over from Europe into the United States, you instantaneously jumped your standard of living by between 30 and 300%, depending on where you were coming from. Right? That's an extraordinary resource that we've now lost. And so, exactly that point of does the metaverse effectively create a release valve that gives people the ability to have hope? Like that is what you're seeing, but there's nothing more damaging than false hope that is then dashed. Right? That's where real chaos emerges. And unfortunately, I think that that's what you're hearing when you hear me say, guys, we are not doing this right. Right? We are not playing this game through and understanding it. Right? We need to have better leaders. We need to have better informed leaders. And one of the things that I think people, we bemoan Nancy Pelosi and everything else. Like the simple reality is she's going to die. Right? She's on her way out. We're going to see turnover in our government. It terrifies me that the leadership that we're putting forward are people like AOC or others, right? I would love to see thoughtful, talented individuals emerge who actually have a component of the humanity to them that says, hey, wait a second, let's actually think about how we design a system that has increasingly scarce physical resources and individuals who feel that they're very separated. I mean, again, that's what I do at Simplify. We're in the process of redesigning retirement systems and various other things, trying to create tools and investment products that allow young people to participate in a system of risk sharing across generations. What the older generation is facing is a system in which they had planned for retirement with interest rates of 6 to 10% and are now facing retirement with interest rates at 0 to 1.5%. Right? The assets that they own don't earn the income that they had expected to rely on in retirement. As a result, they're not taking coupon payments. They're desperately holding on with, talons basically to the assets that they have and making them unavailable to the younger generation. And
yeah.
we need to figure out how we move across generations and share that risk and those opportunities across generations. We're not doing a good job of it today.
Well, and then again, I'll argue this is exactly why Bitcoin captures the mind of young
Of course.
people. I mean, it's just like there's no, and then it plays into the hopelessness that they feel. And I'm hoping the metaverse will give that opportunity, that it will at least give that valve, because I do see a clear cut, reflection with my generation where I'm like looking around and we can't even rent houses and don't have kids, or maybe we do, and then it's like it's actually pretty, when I think about it, it's pretty shit. It's actually, when I really break it down, because you literally realize the good days were behind you, and that's one of the hardest things I think for a lot of people to swallow, because it's hard to see how it gets better. Now I do agree with one thing. It's great that there's going to be a leadership change, that by nature will take care of effectively the old timers who are just going to hopefully retire or find their way going wherever they need to be. And then there will be a generation of leaders that come in here. Yes, there'll be those who are non-system designers. We hopefully will get some system designers, and hopefully we don't get sociopaths, but I'm sure we'll get a mix of them all. And if there's one thing that basically I think that gives me some hope in this, is that we do know how crappy things can be. I don't think anyone wants a repeat of the financial crisis. I don't think we want endless wars again. I think people want to have some understanding that life can be improved. But this idea of fairness, which, honestly was there for a while, I think that's what we're trying to grab onto. And at least I can say, at least in games, because in games it is a meritocracy. you do build things, you do see the results of what you create. I hope that basically can come through here, because if we can't, it's not going to be a place I want to have my kids. I mean, this is just it would be really crappy.
No, I think you actually just hit on something. So there's the movie Contact with Jodie Foster and Matthew McConaughey, right? There's a phenomenal line
Great
in
movie.
that where she has traveled off into time space. We're not actually quite sure what she's traveled into. And she observes that you should have sent a poet, not a scientist, right? What we need are the systems designers that are capable of playing through the system, that are capable of honestly looking at the design of the systems, building the simulations that allow us to effectively say, okay, let's play this forward, right? Is the gameplay here equitable? Is the gameplay here designed to enhance everybody's wealth? Or is it designed for takings, right?
Yeah.
That's what we need to do. And so again, that's part of the reason why I'm here, part of the reason why you and I interact as such, good friends and thoughtful, sounding boards, because at the end of the day, it's that systems approach. It's that understanding of how do you play the game forward, and do we build the rules so that everybody has the opportunity to succeed, as compared to, well, I'm going to get mine and I'm going to keep mine, right? The most desperate, hopeless situations that we've seen, you and I have traveled significantly, lived in various places around the world, are the third world countries where effectively a local population has become trapped by an elite population who effectively is extractive. And that's the direction that we're heading in the United States. Now, the enthusiasm for Bitcoin, and again, it goes back to the language, right? Okay, boomer, right? There's a designation that, hey, maybe this is an opportunity for us to take something from them. Man, you're being played. You're being played. And I'm not a boomer. I'm a Gen Xer. By definition, I'm going to get screwed in this process,
Yeah,
right? We
exactly.
have no political representation, nor will we ever have political representation.
And I think that's a good point right there. You are an Xer. That's, and we know what happened to you guys. So
Well, look, we can look back on that with anger and regret, or we can look back at it and say, no, you know what? I was left to my own devices and was given the opportunity to figure out how to design games and build a life for myself and my family that is better than that existed for my children,
exactly.
right? My parents made one very real sacrifice. They gave me access to the best education that money could buy, right? And they made tremendous sacrifices around that. Now, they were screwed up in any number of ways around that. And the stress that providing that created for them was part of the problem. But the reality is that they gave me the opportunity, they gave my sister the opportunity to construct a life that fits my parameters, and has done so in a way that I'll be eternally grateful for. But it is a reality that we are a population minority. It is a reality that we lack political representation. All I can do now at this stage is make the same sacrifices and efforts for my children, so that the world that they inhabit is better, and hopefully my grandchildren after that.
Mike, honestly, I could talk to you forever, and I appreciate all of your time sharing your wisdom with everyone who's listening and watching. Let me just ask you one thing. For the people out there that want to be Mike Green, that want to follow in your footsteps to become and get to where you have, do you have any tips for them? What should they be looking at to basically kind of follow up in your footsteps, so to speak?
Well, like I said, my life works for me. I'm not sure it would work for anyone else, right? And I don't know that I would necessarily wish on anyone else the path that I have followed, although I've had great adventures, and I'm very happy to be where I am today. Look, the single most important thing that I would encourage people to do is to think critically. And in order to do that, you need to read, you need to educate yourself. You cannot absorb things that are taught to you. You need to challenge at every stage of the process. Say, what are the assumptions that underpin the model? What does the system play out at, right? I think programming is an extraordinary resource. It's one I've tried to give my children with limited success, because it forces you to start from the standpoint of constraints. What are the limitations of the system? And then build to something that works within that. I actually would push back to a certain extent and say, we all know what bad times look like. I actually think that's part of the problem, right? There's this wonderful phrase that's out there. Rob Henderson at Oxford has introduced it. It's called luxury beliefs, right? Things you can believe when you have the resources that allow you to ignore realities, right? Oh my gosh, what a terrible life you must have had because, you were raised with a deeper shade of melatonin than I was, right? there's elements of that within socioeconomic frameworks that exist, and there are absolutely discriminations that exist within a system. But policies of victimization, et cetera, are fundamentally a luxury that exists when you're not trying to pick food off of the ground to survive, right? We all live in a world in which there are extraordinary surplus of luxury beliefs, right? The idea that we can escape to nature in a Rousseau type framework, and that that's going to somehow give us a more holistic life, or that food is always in abundance, or that shelter is a right, or that healthcare is a right, right? These are luxuries that didn't exist throughout human history until the very recent past. And we now take them for granted. They are luxury beliefs, right? And so I would actually argue that part of the problem is people have no concept of how bad it can get and how quickly it can get bad.
Hmm. That is actually that very true. I mean, we always say first world problems. We
Right.
don't know what it's like to starve and not find food. I mean, that's what a lot of immigrants who come from war torn countries, they know. They
Yeah.
know very well. I mean, my mom tells me all the time, straight up, never stops to remind me of this is what this feels like. These are the signs. And when you grow up with people like that, you appreciate everything because everything
Yep.
that you know what this better than nothing. Everything is compared to nothing or -10. It's like it's not in there. So that's a very good point. I think that's on that standpoint, actually, the books that you think for critical thinking. If there were three books for people to read, what would they be?
Oh boy. All right. So just full disclosure, somebody did an inventory of the books in my house. I've got over 3,500 books in my house. So picking out three is going to be really, really hard.
For the young
Um,
person, let's put it that way.
yeah. Well, for the not too young person, I would encourage there's a Bible sized book by Eric Beinhocker called The Origin of Wealth. It's an introduction to systems thinking. It's an introduction to the concept of what economic wealth and creation actually are tied to. To me, it is very much a go to book. The second book, and you can choose whichever one you want, but read a religious text. Don't study it. Don't pretend it's the truth. Read the Bible. I personally have read the Bible, I believe, 30 times, right? I'm not religious. I'm an atheist. I've read the Quran. I've read, various books on Taoism, etc. Right? I've not actually read the fundamental teachings of Confucianism and Buddhism. But the reality is, you need to understand that these are instruction manuals for how you're supposed to live a life without many of the luxuries that you have today, right? And the last book, geez, all right, here's one totally out of left field: The Autobiography of Benjamin Franklin.
That's a great one. Yeah. 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 Man, seriously, awesome conversation. And again, thank you for coming on here. If people want to follow you and basically shout out to you, how can they find you? Where can they reach you at?
Well, the easiest way to hit me is, or to follow my stuff, is my Twitter account, which you mentioned nobody will recognize me. I don't know if this is actually even a visual podcast, but my Twitter account is at profplum99, PROFPLUM 99. The avatar is Vicini from The Princess Bride. And that's kind of the easiest way to get an introduction to how I think and what I do.
Thank you very much. Everyone, thank you for joining us, listening to, again, Mike Green. This was a fascinating conversation. Thanks again, Mike. And thank you to all our listeners out there, viewers. You can find us at Starveup on Twitter or at VGRT on Twitter or at our website, videogamesrealtalk.com. Of course, as always, please leave your feedback, your comments. Please like and subscribe. And of course, share with your friends. We'll be back with you again next week. Until then, keep on doing what you do. And thank you again for spending time with us.